All right, so welcome to your second podcast for the final exam review. This one is going to review chapters 18 and chapters 20. And so just to go ahead and get started, when we started out about chapter 18, I asked each table to give me some information about some strategies or techniques or things that you wanted to continue through your coaching process or to make sure you continue after your coaching process to really have individuals become self-reliant. And self-reliance is basically where they rely on their own knowledge and their own skills for a period of a minimum of 6 months or longer. That's critical to know. That's also the maintenance stage of the trans-theoretical model, but 6 months or longer would be considered self-reliant. And so you guys came up with some good suggestions. One of the first ones that we talked about was goal setting, how important it is to make sure that you're setting good goals at the beginning with your particular client, and that goals, obviously, we need to make sure that goals are smart, obviously that they're specific, measurable, obtainable, they're realistic, and that they have a timepiece to them. Goals also need to be able to be tracked. They need to have some sort of formal action plan. So basically, if you set a goal, what's the plan on having to be able to achieve that goal? They also need to be prioritized and basically start from long term and work your way down to short goals. So it's always imperative when you're working with a client to not set short-term goals first, but to say, okay, ultimately, where do you want to be? Which is basically being self-reliant. Where do you want to be with your physical activity or your nutrition or your stress? And then take that goal and break it down into smaller goals. Okay, so working from long-term back down to short-term. We also said if you can get them to figure out ways to practice on their own, how can you do that to encourage them to practice on their own? So we talked about a behavioral contract. Sometimes individuals, when they know they're being held to a certain standard by somebody else and they have it on paper, it's beneficial. Self-rewards are very important, but we need to make sure that those rewards are going to be healthy rewards that reinforce healthy behavior. So not focusing on unhealthy rewards to achieve healthy behavior. That would not be a way that we want to go. And then help them find ways to self-monitor. What works best for them? Is it an app? Is it a journal? Is it a check-in with a friend? Is it a video recording? Whatever it is, to be able to help them do some self-monitoring is a good way to get them to practice on their own. Then we talked about the support system, where they need a positive support system, understanding that just because they have family and friends does not always necessarily equate to a supportive system. So who is going to be there to listen when they're having a down day? Who is going to be there to basically go hand in hand with them to make sure that they're making the same healthy choices as they're trying to achieve with their goal? We also talked about coping with setbacks. Self-monitoring can help get them back on track. We know that it's important to reinforce any successes that have been achieved. And this is a good area here where motivational interviewing can come into play. Okay, so you may have to go back to your motivational interviewing skills. And then lastly, we talked about how to create or maintain that built environment. So doing an inventory of your environment is really a good thing to do. Placing or identifying places or cues that promote negative behavior and being able to identify those ahead of time and staying away from those is an ideal thought as well. And then we talked about some core competencies. And so this was, again, sort of the last thing that I left you guys with on Monday. Was I wanted to make sure that I had showed you what is sort of considered the coaching core competencies by the International Coaching Federation and some of the things that we had worked on throughout the semester. And the first thing we talked about is setting the foundation. And basically all health coaches need to be able to understand and know the ethical guidelines and the professional standards. So the ability to understand coaching ethics and standards to apply them appropriately in all coaching situations. Clearly communicates the distinction between coaching and consulting and counseling. So how do you do that? Being able to refer clients to another support professional as needing, and knowing when this is needed and what those available resources are. We also talked about, within setting the foundation, that coaching agreement, okay, being able to understand what is required in the specific coaching interaction, and being able to come to agreement with the client about the coaching process and the relationship, being able to understand the parameters of the coaching relationship. So what are the logistics? What are the fees? What's the scheduling? Are there going to be other people that need to be included? Being able to reach agreement about what is appropriate in the relationship and what is not, what is and is not being offered, and really about the client and the coach's responsibilities, and to really determine whether there is an effective sort of match between the coach and the client to be successful. Okay, so that was sort of, I guess you would say, area 1. Area 2 talked about co-creating the relationship. So within co-creating the relationship, we talked about trust and rapport with the client, creating a safe and supportive environment that sort of produces mutual respect and trust. Again, showing genuine concern for their welfare, demonstrating personal honesty and integrity, establishing, clear agreements and keeping those promises, keeping that schedule, demonstrate respect for the client's perceptions, their learning style, their personal being, their personal opinions, and just being able to provide that ongoing support and champions for sort of those new behaviors that they're wanting to try to achieve, those new actions. We also said, too, within this parameter about having a coaching presence, so being fully conscious and being ready to be spontaneous and create new ideas with the client, being flexible, not being a know-it-all, being willing to take different risks with the client, using humor effectively. These are all sort of pieces considered under that second area of co-creating the relationship. That third area that we talked about was about communicating effectively. And so we did look at several different communication styles this semester, one being active listening. So the ability really to focus completely on what the client is saying or not saying, and really to understand the meaning of what is said in context of the client's desires, and really to be, just a supportive individual for that particular client. Attending to their agenda and not what you want. So it's about the client's agenda and not the coach's agenda. Being able to hear what their concerns and their values are. Being able to summarize or paraphrase or reiterate or mirror something back to them that they have said. Another entity inside this area, we talked about powerful questioning, being able to, evoke, being able to ask open-ended questions to get more clarity, having direct communication, so being able to clearly articulate feedback and being able to reframe and articulate what the client is saying. And then the last area that we talked about was facilitating learning and results. And this was all about creating awareness. This was all about being able to design actions for the client, helping them plan and goal set, and being able to, manage their progress and their accountability. Okay, so that's essentially, that last one is really, once you sort of have established what the plan is going to be, sort of sticking to those guns and moving forward with it. Okay? So that was some of the information that we shared from Chapter 18 in the classroom. Chapter 20 focused on the legal guidelines and professional responsibilities. And so we started out talking about why the scope of practice is important. Again, we talked about not getting sued for doing something that's outside of your scope, that you aren't held liable if you are sued. Obviously, it's important because we don't want anybody getting hurt, and it also helps to keep the integrity of your certification or your profession. Now, we talked about what is the scope for a health coach, and it really depends, okay? It depends on two things. It depends on what does your training or your certification say that you can do, and it also depends on what the state laws where you practice say that you can do. Okay, so it's really important for health coaches, personal trainers, people that go into nutrition, or any healthcare profession outside of health promotion and education to understand what the state law says about what you can and can't do, what you can and can't say. So then I gave you guys what I considered my checklist as a health coach from my experiences, and it included several pieces. First was unless you're licensed to do so, you really need to focus more on group recommendations versus individual recommendations. So what's good for the group is always a good rule to follow. You don't want to claim or attempt that you diagnose, that you treat, that you prevent, that you cure, or that you heal. So you want to stay away from those five terms. We also talked about having liability insurance coverage of at least $1 million, building your team so that you have expertise to refer to quickly. Also want to make sure you have an attorney that you can call anytime with questions, and have your documents and your templates prepared in advance and reviewed ahead by an attorney is really important. I also said that you don't want to claim to be something that you are not. So if you want to claim yourself as a health and wellness coach, then you need to get trained and you need to be certified. So you're going to have to invest in yourself. So invest a little bit of money into that training piece, into that certification so that you can use those credentials. And once you have those credentials, you want to keep them current and you want to engage in that professional development so that you can stay on top of the ever-changing world of health and wellness, which it does quite often. And you need to know your business and your craft, and you need to be able to invest time in it. Okay, so the next thing that we went into that next session was we talked a lot about the business structure. Okay, so we said the type of business structure under which you will operate, or where you are employed at the time if there is an incident occurs, will usually be referenced by the courts in the event of a lawsuit. Okay, and so which structure do you want to fall under? We listed 3 different types of structures that most health coaches fall under. One was sole proprietorship, which is basically you're the individual that owns the business and you're responsible for all of its debts and actions. Secondly, we talked about a partnership, which is 2 or more people that act as co-owners. And then the third is what we talked about as a corporation, which is, again, most advantageous way for health coaches to typically start out in the business. Okay, and we listed sort of reasons, and we talked about independent contractors versus employees. An employee is a regular work for the employer. They work regularly. Contractors are hired on a short-term basis for a specific task, and obviously once that task is over and completed, they move on and they're no longer employed there. Some of the pros and cons, obviously, if you work for an employer, they are responsible for the training and supervision. So typically if there's money involved, they're going to pay that. They're responsible for maintaining those records so that you don't have to actually do that yourself. They're going to provide the space for that. Employers will actually withhold and match employees' taxes, which is important, okay, so that you're already having taxes taken out. And providing justification for firing an employee, they have to be able to do that versus a contractor. They can fire you at any time for anything. So we talked a little bit about some pros and cons, and then we went into contracts and terms of use. And so we talked about the elements that need to be there that are necessary to create a binding contract. Would basically be there needs to be an offer and an acceptance with a mutual agreement. There needs to be considerations, there needs to be legality, and there needs to be ability of the parties to enter into a contract with respect to legal age and mental capacity. Okay, and so we mentioned using a contract to establish payment terms, rescheduling. What are you going to do if a client gives you a bounced check? How are you going to maintain confidentiality? And how are we going to terminate this relationship if need be? And then I shared a link to some templates, some do-it-yourself templates through a legal attorney that you could purchase, which I think are awesome. And we talked a little bit about agreements to participate, informed consent, and waivers. And we had spoken a little bit about that in a previous chapter. These should all be printed, not handwritten, and they should be signed before your first session starts. Again, you want to consult an attorney that will look over any of your documents that you're going to use, which would be very important. We talked about an agreement to participate, which is basically talking about the potential risk, specifically with physical activity. A lot of times we use an agreement to participate in sort of a class setting versus a one-on-one setting. And an agreement to participate typically shows and details what is the nature of the activity, what are the potential risks, and what are the expected behaviors of the actual participant. And there is an example in your textbook on page 586. It's figure 20-2. Gives you an example. We also talked about inherent risk, agreements to participate, and informed consent forms primarily cover the inherent risk of participation in an activity. Again, health coaches should have all clients sign a waiver prior to beginning any exercise routine, and that every waiver, sometimes it's called a release, should include an exculpatory clause, which is basically a contract provision that relieves one party of liability if damages are caused during the execution of the contract. And so the party that issues the exculpatory clause is typically the one seeking to be relieved of the potential liability. So in this case, it would be the health coach or the personal trainer. Okay. We talked a little bit about procedures, valid agreements to participate, informed consent forms, waivers, to be administered properly to clients. You need to be very transparent with them. You need to make sure that the documents are translated in more of an easy to understand terms. I would actually have an initial section for each page where they initial saying that they understand what the information is on each individual page. Again, if you've got minors, so if you're going to be working with children, you need to talk to an attorney that is practicing in that state, because some states allow parents to sign for minors and some do not. So you need to make sure you consult an attorney about that. And you want to make sure that every individual signs a waiver, that it's not just one for the whole group. And then we talked about the statute of limitations as far as keeping this paperwork readily available and keeping it confidential. And in Georgia, you have 2 years to file a lawsuit in the civil court. So you must keep your paperwork for at least 2 years. Okay, so that's the responsibility there when it comes to procedures and paperwork in Georgia. We also talked a little bit about negligence, that there's 2 types of negligence. There's act of omission, which basically you fail to act, and then there's act of commission, which is when you act inappropriately, so like you give the wrong advice or recommendation. I also shared a court case from the personal trainer from New York, so I shared that particular case to sort of show an act of commission example. And we also talked about to substantiate a charge of neglect in court, the plaintiff must establish 4 elements. Okay, and those 4 elements are: the defendant had a duty to protect the plaintiff. The defendant failed to uphold the standard of care. There was damage or injury that occurred, and this damage or injury was caused by the defendant's breach of duty. And then we talked a little bit about legal responsibilities, that health coaches should prepare for each training session with safety as their #1 priority. I have an understanding of the following responsibilities. So basically, what do they need to do to ensure that the facility is safe? Do they have the proper equipment? Do they have the proper supervision, instruction, certification? Do they have AEDs available? Do they have first aid kit supplies available? We did, and I gave a copy of the Code of Ethics for ACE, and so there is a copy in CourseDen, so you need to know what the Code of Ethics are for that particular organization. And lastly, we talked a little bit about liability insurance. Okay, so generally an insurance policy is a contract designed to protect health coaches and their assets from litigation, and health coaches should understand that there's different options. So insurance rider, so if you're going to do anything with private residents, this is a protection there for private residents. Umbrella liability, we talked about that being gap insurance, what is not covered by other insurance that you may have. Product liability, so if you're going to sell any products, and of course personal liability, you need to have of at least $1 million. Okay, so that is going to conclude chapters 18 and chapters 20.